Imagine standing in your kitchen today, staring at a receipt that somehow hit £100, even though the trolley felt half empty. Ready meals, takeaways, meal deals that never really feel like a deal. Now picture Britain almost a century ago, when families had far less money, far fewer options, and yet somehow managed to fill plates with food that was hot, generous, and deeply satisfying. During the Depression years, British homes became quiet laboratories of survival. Mothers, grandmothers, and often older children learned to transform the cheapest scraps of meat, bags of potatoes, a few onions, and a handful of dried peas into meals that could feed 6 or 8 people and still have someone going back for seconds. These dishes weren't fancy, they weren't dressed up for social media, but they were clever, comforting, and astonishingly good. Tonight on British History, we're going back into those tiny terraced kitchens, the back-to-back houses, the soot-stained streets of Manchester, Liverpool, the Welsh valleys, and the Cornish coast, to rediscover 15 Depression-era British meals that were not only budget-friendly, they were genuinely delicious. Let's start at number 15. Quindici, Lancashire hot pot, mill workers' slow-cooked miracle. If you grew up in the north, you can probably still smell it. That slow, savoury perfume of onions, lamb, and potatoes melding together all day in a battered old dish in the oven. Lancashire hot pot wasn't invented for show. It was born out of sheer necessity. Mill workers in Manchester and the surrounding towns often worked 12-hour shifts, leaving home before the sun came up and returning long after it set. There was no time to fuss over a complicated dinner, but there was time, just before they left, to build something clever and let the oven do the work. They started with the bits nobody else wanted: lamb neck, shoulder, or old mutton with more bone than meat. Cheap, tough, and full of flavour. Those pieces went into a heavy dish at the bottom, often with the bone left in because every bit of collagen and marrow meant more richness in the final meal. Over that, a layer of onions sliced almost paper thin, spread carefully so that every corner of the dish got some sweetness. Then came the real magic: potatoes. Not thrown in at random, but sliced to almost exactly the same thickness and carefully layered. The bottom layers would sit in the juices and become soft, creamy, and almost buttery. The top layer had a different job entirely. Each slice overlapped the one before it, like roof tiles on a terrace house, forming a tight, protective lid. A bit of stock or even just water went in, not too much, or it turned into soup, just enough to create steam and help the meat slowly break down. Then the dish went into a low oven. While the family spent the day in the mill, breathing in lint and dust, their tea quietly transformed itself at home. 8 hours later, you'd lift that dish out and crack through the golden potato crust with a spoon. Underneath, lamb that fell apart with a touch of a fork, onions that had melted into a sweet, savoury tangle, and potatoes at the bottom that had drunk up every drop of flavour. One pot, made from the cheapest ingredients in the butchers and greengrocers, could feed a whole family for less than what we now pay for a single takeaway. It wasn't just food, it was comfort after a brutal day's work, a small piece of luxury built from scraps. 14. Scouse, Liverpool's lesson in stretching a penny. Head west to Liverpool, and you find another masterpiece of thrift: scouse. The name comes from the sailors' stew lobscouse, but Liverpudlian families turned it into something uniquely their own, and astonishingly efficient. The secret was simple: potatoes did the heavy lifting. In many homes, there might be 5 potatoes for every tiny piece of meat, sometimes more. Meat was there for flavour, not for bulk. What you mostly ate was vegetables, but cooked so cleverly that nobody felt shortchanged. It all began with the browning, whatever meat scraps a family could afford. A bit of cheap beef, maybe some lamb, maybe just bones with a whisper of flesh, went into the bottom of a heavy pot. They weren't just heated, they were browned until the underside of the pan was coated with deep, dark, sticky bits of caramelized meat. That crust, the fond, was pure flavour. Next came the vegetables in order. Onions first, cooked low and slow until they softened and turned sweet, picking up that flavour from the pan. Then carrots, cut chunky so they'd hold their shape, but soften enough to release their natural sugars. Only then came the potatoes. A mountain of them, cut into chunks, some destined to dissolve into the stew and thicken it, others to stay whole and give you something to bite into. Everything simmered for hours. As time went on, potatoes broke down slightly, Starch thickened the liquid, and that thin broth turned into a rich, velvety gravy that clung to every piece of veg. The stew smelled far meatier than it actually was. On the hardest weeks, when there was no meat at all, families made blind scouse, just vegetables and potatoes, treated with the same care and patience. Even then, it felt like a proper meal, especially with bread to mop the bowl. Children would argue over who got to scrape the bottom of the pot, because that's where the flavours gathered. In a world where we throw away leftovers without thinking, scouse is a reminder of just how far you can stretch ingredients when every penny counts. 13. Shepherd's pie and cottage pie, architecture in a baking dish. Today, shepherd's pie and cottage pie are comfort food classics, but in Depression-era Britain, they were also a practical engineering solution for an awkward problem: how to feed a lot of people with very little meat. It started at the butcher's. Rather than asking for prime cuts, thrifty cooks would request mince made from trimmings and offcuts, the sort of pieces other customers didn't want, odds and ends from different parts of the animal, ugly to look at but packed with flavour. Back in the kitchen, that mince went into a pan to be properly browned, not just turned grey. It was stirred and spread out until it formed deep, dark, crusty bits on the bottom. That browning process created more flavour than the expensive cuts many of us buy today. Diced onions, carrots, and any other vegetables needing to be used up went in next, cooked in the rendered fat. A spoonful of flour followed, stirred through the mixture to thicken it once liquid was added. Then came a splash of stock, or even just water, and sometimes a splash of Worcestershire sauce if you were lucky. Slowly, it turned into a glossy, savoury mince mixture. Meanwhile, potatoes were working their own quiet magic. Boiled until truly tender, then mashed with butter, a little milk, and sometimes a spoonful of leftover dripping, they became soft, cloud-like peaks. But again, technique mattered. The mashed potato wasn't simply slapped over the top. It was spread thickly, then combed with a fork into ridges and peaks. In the oven, those ridges were transformed. The tips turned golden and crisp, while the valleys stayed soft and creamy. Underneath, the mince bubbled away, the steam trapped under that potato roof. When the dish came to the table, it looked like something from a restaurant window, browned, bubbling, deeply inviting. Yet underneath that showpiece top, there might only be a very small amount of meat, cleverly supported by vegetables and potatoes. One modest portion of mince could feed 6, 7, even 8 people. No one left the table hungry. It was architecture as much as cooking. Layers, structure, and a crisp golden roof holding everything together. 12. Toad in the hole, turning sad sausages into a feast. The name might sound ridiculous, but Toad in the Hole is a masterclass in Depression-era alchemy, taking a few miserable-looking sausages and turning them into a meal big enough for the whole family. The sausages themselves were rarely glamorous. They were often the cheapest on offer, full of cereal, water, and mystery meat. But that didn't matter. The genius lay in how they were used. First, those sausages went into a heavy tin or cast iron pan and into a very hot oven. They were left until they began to sizzle and spit, releasing fat and browning all over. That shimmering layer of sausage fat at the bottom of the pan was liquid gold. While that was happening, the cook whisked together a simple batter: flour, eggs and milk in the same proportions you'd use for Yorkshire pudding. No fancy ingredients, just the basics, beaten until smooth and a little airy. Then came the crucial moment. With the fat now smoking hot, the pan was pulled from the oven, and the batter poured in around the sausages in one confident go. The sound was dramatic, a furious hiss, as the batter hit the fat and started cooking instantly. Back into the oven it went, with no opening the door to just check unless you wanted disaster. Over the next half hour or so, something magical happened. The batter rose up around the sausages, climbing the sides of the pan, puffing and blistering into huge golden walls of crisp, airy pudding. What began as 2 or 3 sad sausages suddenly looked like a generous roast. Crisp on the outside, soft and custardy, where the batter had soaked up sausage juices, each slice was filling and full of flavour. Paired with a little gravy and maybe some vegetables, 1 or 2 sausages magically stretched to feed 4 people. Children loved it because it looked fun and dramatic. Parents loved it because it cost almost nothing. 11. Bangers and mash, engineering the perfect plate. We hear bangers and mash and think of pub grub. But during hard times, this was serious business. a way to turn a couple of sausages into a deeply satisfying family dinner. The bangers got their name in the war years because cheap sausages, stuffed with water and fillers, would literally bang and burst if you fried them too fast. Depression-era cooks knew how to handle them. They pricked them carefully with a fork, then cooked them slowly, turning them gently until their skins browned, blistered, and split just enough to reveal the juicy insides. That fat left in the pan was never wasted. While the sausages rested, that same pan became the foundation for onion gravy. Onions were sliced thin and cooked low and slow in the sausage fat until they turned golden and sweet, the kitchen filling with a smell that could make a hungry child hover by the stove. A bit of flour was sprinkled in, stirred until it coated every strand of onion, then stock or water was added gradually, whisked in to create a glossy, rich gravy. On another ring of the stove, potatoes were boiling away. They were cooked until they practically collapsed at the touch of a fork, then mashed with butter, milk, and sometimes a spoonful of that precious sausage fat. The goal was a mash that could stand in peaks, creamy but not wet. When it all came together on the plate, it was simple but spectacular. A generous mound of mash, sausages nestled on top, and onion gravy poured over until it ran in little rivers down the sides. The brilliance was in the balance. You didn't need many sausages if the potatoes were creamy and the gravy was rich. 2 bangers and a pile of mash could feel like a feast, especially after a long, cold day. 10. Bubble and squeak, Monday morning magic. If Sunday roast was the highlight of the week, Monday's bubble and squeak was proof that nothing went to waste. In Depression-era Britain, you didn't throw away a single potato if you could help it. By Monday morning, the leftovers from Sunday's dinner would be waiting. A bowl of cold mashed potatoes, some cabbage, sprouts, carrots, or whatever vegetables were left. On their own, they looked tired and unappealing. But in the right hands, they were about to become something far more exciting. All those leftovers were chopped and mixed together into a rough, chunky mixture. The key was balance, enough potato to bind everything, enough vegetables to give colour and flavour. The name bubble and squeak came from the sound it made in the pan, the gentle bubbling and squeaking as moisture escaped and the edges crisped. A heavy frying pan was set over the heat with a generous spoonful of fat, dripping save from the roast, lard, or whatever was available. The mixture was pressed into the pan, then left alone. That was the hard part. You had to resist poking it. It needed time to form a deep, golden crust. After several patient minutes, sections were flipped or folded over so that new surfaces could brown. By the time it was done, you had a patchwork of crisp, nutty, caramelized bits and soft, fluffy interior. Children who had stubbornly refused cabbage or sprouts on Sunday would happily eat them on Monday, folded into this golden, crispy mixture. Served with a fried egg or a scrap of leftover meat if you had it, bubble and squeak turned almost forgotten leftovers into a meal that felt new, cozy and indulgent for pennies. 9. Liver and onions with bacon, nutrition disguised as comfort. Liver is a dividing line today, but during the Depression, it was a quiet hero of the British table. Cheap, available, and incredibly nutritious, it offered iron and vitamins that many families desperately needed if you knew how to cook it properly. Most people who hated liver did so because they'd only ever had it cooked badly. Thrown into a hot pan, overcooked until it was grey and rubbery, tasting of metal and misery. Depression-era cooks learned the tricks that turn this tough sell into a beloved regular meal. Step 1 was soaking. Thin slices of lamb or beef liver were left to rest in a bowl of milk for half an hour or more. It sounds like superstition, but it wasn't. The milk helped draw out some of the harsher metallic notes and left the liver milder and sweeter. Meanwhile, bacon went into a pan first, rendered slowly until it was crisp, and the fat had melted out into the bottom of the pan. The bacon strips were lifted out and set aside, but that glorious fat stayed where it was. Next came the onions. Sliced and added to the bacon fat, they were cooked low and patient, stirred until they turned golden, soft and sweet. This could take 20 minutes or more, but the result was worth it. Onions that tasted almost like jam, ready to coat everything in flavour. Only then did the liver appear. It was patted dry, dusted lightly in seasoned flour, and fried quickly in the hot pan, just long enough to brown the outside while keeping the inside tender and soft. Overcooking was the enemy. A good cook timed it almost to the second. On the plate, everything came together beautifully. A bed of creamy mashed potato, slices of tender liver laid on top, golden onions spooned over, and crisp bacon crumbled across the lot. For families on tight budgets, this meal was a gift. It cost a fraction of what a steak would, but delivered more nutrition, and when cooked with care, just as much satisfaction. Children might pull a face at the idea of liver, but many quietly cleaned their plates once they'd tasted it in this form. We've only reached number 9, and already you can see the pattern. Clever technique, patient cooking, and a refusal to waste anything. 8. Steak and kidney pie, the courageous classic. There is something uniquely British about a steak and kidney pie. It's hearty, unapologetic, and full of depth, a dish that doesn't pretend to be delicate or refined. But during the Depression years, it was far more than comfort food. It was a lesson in bravery, thrift, and absolute culinary wisdom. The ingredients would make many modern shoppers hesitate. The steak was never prime rib or sirloin. It was shin, chuck, brisket cuts, filled with connective tissue that needed time. Cuts that looked unappealing sitting behind the butcher's counter, but which transformed into luxuriously tender pieces if shown patience. And then, of course, the kidneys. Often given away for next to nothing, simply because most people didn't know how to prepare them properly. But those who did, they understood their value. Kidneys weren't filler, they were flavor bombs, releasing deep, savory richness that no stock cube could ever replicate. Preparation took time. Kidneys were trimmed carefully of every bit of gristle, then soaked in salted water to mellow their strong notes. The steak was browned in batches, the meat searing on all sides to build layers of caramelized flavor. Each batch added more depth to the pot, the kitchen filling with that unmistakable aroma of slow-cooked beef. Then everything simmered together for hours. Tough cuts softened, kidney pieces melted into the gravy. The sauce thickened into a dark, glossy, deeply savory lake. It wasn't rushed. It was given the time it deserved. The final miracle came from the pastry. Depression-era pastry wasn't always buttery or extravagant. Often it was simple: flour, fat, water rolled carefully and laid over the top. But when it baked, turning golden and puffed, and you cut into it for the first time, steam poured out like a fog from a Cornish cliffside. Inside, the filling glistened, dark, rich, beautiful. And every bite reminded families that even the humblest ingredients could become something extraordinary when paired with patience and skill. 7. Cornish pasty, engineering for survival. The Cornish pasty is one of Britain's greatest inventions. Not just because it tastes wonderful, but because it was designed, truly engineered to solve a very specific problem. In the mines of Cornwall, men worked long, dangerous shifts underground, surrounded by dust, darkness, and soot. They needed a meal they could hold with filthy hands, carry in their pockets, and eat in the dim light of a lamp. A meal that wouldn't fall apart, spoil, or require utensils they didn't have. And so, the Cornish pasty was born. The pastry was engineered deliberately thick along the crimped edge, not for decoration, but to act as a built-in handle. Miners would eat their way through the pasty until they reached the crimped edge, which they discarded so they didn't ingest the arsenic dust and mining grime on their fingers. Inside the pastry was a carefully balanced mixture: diced potatoes for bulk, onions for moisture and sweetness, turnip or swede for body, and just a small handful of beef to give flavour. There was rarely much meat, sometimes only a few tiny cubes. But the genius of the pasty was that as it baked, the vegetables released steam and moisture, mixing with the beef juices to create its own natural gravy, sealed inside the pastry pocket. A whole meal, self-contained, portable, filling and cheap. Some families even made half-and-half pasties, meat and veg on one side, jam or fruit on the other, a main course and dessert in one pastry shell. For Depression-era households, the pasty was proof that food didn't need to be expensive to feel satisfying and complete. It was working-class ingenuity wrapped in golden pastry. 6. Suet dumpling stew, turning a thin broth into a feast. There are few dishes more comforting on a cold night than a stew thick with dumplings. But during the Depression era, this wasn't just comfort, it was strategy. The stew itself often started off very modest: a bone with a little meat still clinging on, a couple of carrots, an onion, maybe some barley, plenty of water, enough to create broth, but not enough to fill a family. The transformation came from suet, the hard white fat from around beef kidneys. It was incredibly cheap because wealthier households didn't bother with it, but poor families understood its power. First, the suet was grated, a process that softened it and ensured it melted evenly. It was mixed with flour, baking powder, salt, and just enough cold water to form a soft, pillowy dough. The trick was not to overwork it. The lighter the touch, the fluffier the dumpling. When the stew reached a simmer, spoonfuls of the dumpling dough would drop gently into the bubbling liquid. Almost immediately, they began to swell. They floated, they absorbed flavor, they released starch, they thickened the broth. What started as a watery soup became a dense, hearty stew with clouds of warm dumplings bobbing on top. Each one was soft, fluffy, and filling. Children adored them. Fishing dumplings out of the pot felt like hunting treasure. With a handful of flour and fat, a thin pot of broth became a dinner that filled every stomach in the house. It was one of the cleverest, simplest tricks in the Depression-era playbook. 4. Fish and chips with mushy peas, nutrition in disguise. To us, fish and chips feels like a treat, but for Depression-era families, it was often a smart, affordable strategy. Why? Because fish was often cheaper than meat, especially close to the coast or when buying fish a day old from the market. A single piece of cod or haddock, dipped in batter, became significantly more filling once wrapped in its crisp golden shell. The chips were thick-cut and substantial, far more so than the thin fries we see today. They were satisfying, calorie-dense, and easy to make from cheap bulk potatoes. Mushy peas were another victory for resourcefulness. Dried marrow-fat peas that cost pennies, soaked overnight and cooked until soft. Together, the dish offered protein, carbohydrates, vitamins, and enough energy for a long day of physical labor. It was a full, nutritious meal disguised as a simple takeaway. And even families who couldn't afford much could often manage a shared portion, wrapped in paper and eaten with fingers still cold from the long walk home. 3. Peas pudding and ham hock, protein for pennies. Few dishes demonstrate Depression-era brilliance like peas pudding and ham hock. Split peas were one of the cheapest forms of protein available, dried, shelf-stable, and bought in big sacks for a few pennies. A ham hock, cheap because it was mostly bone and skin, was used not for its meat but for its flavor. As it simmered slowly, collagen melted into the pot, turning everything rich and silky. Hours of gentle cooking transformed the peas into a thick, creamy, porridge-like pudding. The ham softened and could be shredded with a fork. When served together, the combination was hearty, deeply savory, and astonishingly cheap. Peas pudding could be eaten hot or cold, spread on bread, served alongside vegetables, or even sliced the next day. It fed large families for pennies and kept them full for hours. 1. Kedgeree, a coastal masterpiece. Finally, we reach kedgeree, a beautifully balanced dish born from necessity and creativity. Smoked fish, often fin and haddy, or other inexpensive varieties lasted longer and cost less than fresh. Families poached it gently to remove excess salt, flaked it carefully, then folded it into rice or potatoes with chopped hard-boiled eggs. A pinch of curry powder, if available, added warmth. Butter added richness when the budget allowed. The dish was reheated until the flavors melded into a comforting, savory blend. Kedgeree was proof that with the right technique, even preserved fish could become a wholesome, satisfying meal that tasted far more luxurious than it was. How much money these meals could save today? Here's the astonishing part. Depression-era techniques still work, and they still save money, a lot of it. Lancashire hot pot, for example, costs around £10, £12 to make today and feeds 6 people. That's roughly £1.70 per portion, 55% cheaper than a takeaway or ready meal. Scouse feeds 8 for under £10. Shepherd's pie can stretch a single pound of mince into a meal for an entire family. When you add up the cost savings, a family of 4 can save £9,000, £16,000 per year. A single person can save £2,200, £4,000 per year race, just by cooking the way our grandparents and great-grandparents did when every shilling mattered. These meals weren't just food, they were creativity, survival, and love served on a plate. If you've enjoyed this journey into the kitchens of Depression-era Britain, I'd love for you to join us here on British History. Please consider subscribing, leaving a comment, and helping us keep these stories alive for future generations. And before you go, tell me this. Which of these timeless meals do you still remember or miss the most? Let's keep the memories alive together.